It is one among many visions of it, what Islam means, and it's a particular set of views, and there's nothing causal about it. But it is absolutely true that there's a population of people who believe that jihad is an important duty of an individual, who define jihad in one particular way, who tremendously dislike militant groups. And there's another group who define jihad in a different way, who support them. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at this and we think, do you support, Sharia law, or do you support the concept of jihad or strong conservative Islam? That is neither necessarily going to lead people to support extremist groups or not. It's like any religion. It's a very complex, multifaceted thing. What I think makes this a harder issue to understand is that if you want to raise money for an insurgency in today's world, one of the flags you can raise is the Islamic rebellion flag, right? Is the Islamism flag. And that opens your cause up to a huge donor population, primarily in the Persian Gulf. And so what I think you see is lots of organizations that are picking fights for local reasons, who then pick up an Islamist banner, not because they deeply believe in it and it's the thing that motivated the rebellion in the first place, but because that's the banner that gets you funding.
And that's a very interesting insight.
But this is exactly what happened in the Cold War, where all these local rebellions waved the communism flag. It wasn't that the people were motivated to rebel in the first place because they wanted to redistribute wealth, right? It was that they needed someone to fund the rebellion,
right?
And the communists were the one who had money on offer. Mm-hmm. And so they said, oh yeah, I'm a communist too. Mm-hmm. And I think you have a very similar process going on now. That said, you can't dispute that this industry has been created which supports and sustains this particular view of what Islam means and what it requires. But that's not a function of Islam per se. That's a function of this kind of market that's evolved.
Since we are talking of data,
for sure.
I was looking at the Global Terrorism Database, and in the 16 years between 2002 and 17, after the war on terror started, there have been about 260,000 lives claimed by terrorism as per the database. And if you go back 16 years before the war on terror, the number was only 140,000. Now, this statistic is often used by people to say that the war on terror has been a failure, that it has led to increase in extremism and terrorism. Do you think this is a fair claim to make in the absence of a counterfactual? And what is your view of these statistics?
So I think that is not a fair claim to make, in the sense that the vast majority of the deaths that you cited in that 216,000 figure have come in the context of the civil wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. And arguably, the civil war in Iraq was a function of the U.S. war on terror and a massive failure by any stretch of the imagination. And you could make the argument, although I think it's wrong, that the civil war in Syria stems from the same source. I think that's incorrect, but people have made that argument. The civil war in Afghanistan was not avoidable in the same way. Right? Once the Taliban refused to hand over bin Laden, there was no world in which the U.S. government could not invade and take over the country. That had to happen for a whole bunch of reasons. The question is then, was the subsequent kind of emergence of violence and intensification of the civil war there a necessary consequence of the war on terror? And my view on that is no. It basically followed from a set of geopolitical imperatives and could have been avoided with better management of the geopolitical concerns of the surrounding states in 2002 to 2006. That management did not happen because the U.S. government was consumed with the war in Iraq. And so, if you want to think about, if you want to define the war on terror as including the invasion of Iraq, then yes, terrible, massive policy failure, all kinds of horrible consequences. If, on the other hand, you want to think separately about the war on terror and the kind of the international community coordinating around preventing transnational terrorism, which it's done quite well compared to the prior period, and separate out what has happened in Iraq, and say that was an idiosyncratic policy mistake of a particular U.S. government, then you, I think, arrive at a very different conclusion.
Picking up on your last point, there is general consensus that the war on terror has made counterterrorism stronger. So in light of that, do you think terrorism will continue to be a big threat to U.S., Western, and global security?
I don't think terrorism is a significant threat to U.S. and global security, except for the potential for massive overreaction to a terrorist attack. Right? So the threat is that there is some bad terrorist attack and states decide to abrogate core civil liberties or core rights that they have granted their citizens in response. That's the threat, right? The numbers killed, the economic damage, even of the worst terrorist attacks, is vanishingly small compared to all kinds of other threats that are out there. Where I think it's a bigger threat is it distorts public policy discourse. It takes time and attention away from problems that cause more suffering, cost more lives, and are more significant security threats. And my sense is that where the international community and the U.S. Are moving is to a more mature understanding of terrorism, in which it is a threat that needs to be defended against and certain kinds of vigilance and intelligence need to go on. But it is not the central driving force in our political and security decision-making. And to me, that's a positive development.
This has been a great chat. I learned so much about counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, how to put the war on terror into perspective, and other stuff. I wish we could talk longer, but we have to stop here. Thank you so much for the interview.
Great. Thanks very much.
And that's a wrap on another episode of UC3P. Thanks to Professor Jake Shapiro for joining us, and to Prabhat Singh for interviewing. This episode was engineered by Sushmita Singha and produced and edited by Susan Paykin. It's my second ask of the episode, but if you wouldn't mind, mention us to a friend. I'm sure they'd love the recommendation. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned. We'll be back next week.
As China's role grows greater on the global stage, you want to stay up to date on the issues most pressing to China both domestically and internationally. Check out the Just China podcast for in-depth analysis on recent headlines and investigative reports on Chinese matters that affect our globalized world. We are Just China. Find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcast listening.